The document landed on the desk between them like a verdict. Isolde Vane did not flinch. She had practiced not flinching for years. Through her father's gambling losses, through the quiet disappearance of the silver, through the morning she had counted the household coins on the kitchen table and understood, with the cold clarity of a woman who had always done the mathematics no one else would, that the Vane family was not merely in debt. They were finished. And yet, here she sat, in the most private study in Rallenmere House, across a mahogany desk from the 8th Duke of Rallenmere himself. Dark-haired, broad-shouldered, impossibly still, holding a sheaf of documents with the unhurried confidence of a man who had never once been made to justify himself. And she was not flinching. She was waiting. The fire behind him threw amber light across the room. Candles burned on the mantelpiece. Somewhere beneath the smell of applewood smoke and old leather was something warmer, something that had no business existing in a room this cold, in a meeting this transactional, between two people this determinedly composed. Caelum Ashford set the documents down. He did not speak immediately. He looked at her the way she had noticed, from the first moment she entered this room, that he looked at everything, with the total, unhurried attention of a man conducting an assessment so thorough it bordered on indecent. His eyes were the color of deep water before a storm, dark, still, and giving nothing away. On the desk between them, every debt the Vane family owed, tradesmen, landlords, 3 moneylenders across 2 counties, a dressmaker who had extended credit 6 seasons past the point of wisdom, the lease on the Vane townhouse, the mortgage on the Hertfordshire estate, every pound, every shilling, every accumulated catastrophe of her father's charming and disastrous life. All of it now bore a single signature. Hi. What would you do if the most powerful man in England purchased every claim against your family overnight? Not as a threat, not as a weapon, but for a reason he has not yet said aloud. If he placed the evidence of it on a desk between you and then simply waited, with the patience of a man who has been waiting for 2 years already, for you to ask the question he has been preparing to answer? If the document he holds is not a demand, but a confession. Isolde looked at the ledger. She looked at his hands, steady and certain on the pages. She looked at his face, which was giving her nothing, which had been giving her nothing since she walked through his door 40 minutes ago, uninvited, and sat down across from him as though she had every right to be there. Which she did, because someone had to ask. She raised her eyes to his. The fire crackled between them. The clock on the mantelpiece marked the silence in careful, indifferent seconds. "Your Grace," she said, and her voice came out exactly as she needed it to, level, clear, carrying the full composed weight of a woman who had learned that steadiness was the only currency that was never devalued. Why? The Duke of Rallenmere looked at her for a long moment, and something moved behind those storm-dark eyes, something that had no business being there, in a man this controlled, in a room this formal, in a negotiation this deliberately transactional. Something that looked unmistakably like relief. Welcome, my friends, to a story about the most dangerous thing a powerful man can do. Not the acquiring, not the controlling, not the cold and methodical dominance that had made Caelum Ashford the most formidable duke in England. The most dangerous thing he ever did was fall silently, completely, and without permission for the one woman who would never, under any circumstances, allow herself to be purchased. Tonight's story takes place in the spring of 1847, in a London that runs on debt and appearances in equal measure, where a family's ruin is conducted in drawing rooms rather than courtrooms, and where a young woman's options narrow with every unpaid bill, until what remains is not a life but a calculation. And it is the story of Isolde Vane, who arrived at a duke's door with nothing but her pride and one direct question. And of Caelum Ashford, the 8th Duke of Rallenmere, who had spent 2 years acquiring every financial claim against her family. Not to destroy her, not to own her, but because it was the only way he knew, in the language he had spoken his entire life, to say something he had never once in 36 years permitted himself to say out loud. I see you. I have always seen you, and I could not bear to watch the world take you apart. But Isolde Vane was not a woman who could be saved without her consent, and Caelum Ashford was not a man who knew how to ask for anything. This is where our story begins. Before we go further, tell me where you are listening from. City, country, time of night. I want to know. Knowing you are out there, in your corner of the world, makes every story feel like a conversation between friends. Tonight, I promise you, this one will make you feel things. The notice arrived on a Tuesday. Isolde read it twice at the kitchen table, in the early gray light before the rest of the household woke, with a cup of tea gone cold at her elbow and the household ledger open beside it. She read it the way she read everything that frightened her, without expression, without movement, with the total stillness of a woman who had learned that panic was a luxury that changed nothing and cost everything. Every debt, every creditor, every accumulated consequence of her father's luminous, catastrophic charm. Purchased overnight, in full, by one man, Caelum Ashford, the 8th Duke of Rallenmere. She closed the ledger. She finished the cold tea. She went upstairs, woke neither of her sisters, and put on the ivory gown. The good one, the one she had altered 3 times across 4 seasons to keep it presentable, so the one she saved for moments that required her to look like a woman who had not spent the previous evening calculating whether they could afford coal through April. Then she went to Rallenmere House. The butler was very good. She could see that immediately. The particular quality of his refusal, polished smooth by years of turning away people far more important than a baronet's eldest daughter with auburn hair and no appointment. He was kind about it, which was almost worse. Isolde smiled at him pleasantly, walked past him into the entrance hall, and sat down in the chair beside the window. He stared at her. She picked up the copy of the Morning Chronicle folded on the side table, his, presumably, unread, and opened it to the financial pages. She had been there for 40 minutes when she heard footsteps on the marble staircase. Not the butler's careful shuffle. Something else. Measured. Unhurried. A look up immediately. She finished the look up immediately. She finished the paragraph. Commodity prices. Nothing useful. And then, with the composure of someone who had decided before she arrived that she would not be the first to show anything. She raised her eyes. He was taller than she had expected. Dark-haired, broad through the shoulders, dressed with the severe elegance of a man who had never needed to try. He stood at the foot of the staircase and looked at her with eyes the color of deep water before a storm. And something crossed his face so briefly she almost missed it. Not surprising. Something quieter than surprise. Something that looked impossibly like recognition. She had never seen him before in her life. He had seen her before. She did not know that yet. "Your Grace," she said. The Duke of Rallenmere looked at her for a long, unreadable moment. Then he said, "Come upstairs." The study was exactly the kind of room that reminded you, quietly and without apology, of the precise distance between what you were and what you would never be. Floor to ceiling bookshelves. A desk of mahogany so dark it absorbed the firelight rather than reflecting it. Candles on the mantelpiece, roses on the side table. Real ones, not the hothouse approximations that passed for flowers in houses that were trying. The fire behind him threw the room into amber, and Isolde sat across the desk from the Duke of Rallenmere and did not look at any of it, because looking at it would cost her something she could not afford. He placed the ledger between them without a preamble. She recognized it immediately. She had kept one exactly like it, smaller, thinner, written in her own careful hand, for 4 years. "I am prepared to cancel the debt entirely," Caelum said. His voice was low and even, the voice of a man who had rehearsed nothing because he never needed to. "Every creditor, every outstanding claim, the Hertfordshire mortgage, the townhouse lease, all of it, forgiven and discharged, with documentation filed before the end of the month." Isolde looked at him. And it was not a question. She had known from the moment he said, "Come upstairs," that there was an and. "1 season," he said. "You will permit me to call on you. You will attend 3 events in my company without public objection. At the end of the season, regardless of what passes between us, the agreement is fulfilled and your family is free." The fire crackled. The clock on the mantelpiece counted the silence. She had expected Kroll's arithmetic. Cold, transactional, I refuse it. She had not prepared for refuse it. She had not prepared for something that sounded with a discomfort she could not immediately locate, like a courtship. "No," she said. He said nothing. He did not argue, did not press, did not produce a counteroffer with the impatient efficiency of a man accustomed to negotiating. He simply looked at her with those storm-dark eyes and waited, with a patience so complete it had its own weight, its own texture, like something that had been practiced over a very long time. She stood. She thanked him, which was either dignity or absurdity, and possibly both. She left. She walked home through streets that smelled of coal smoke and coming rain, and she sat at the kitchen table, and she opened her household ledger, and she looked at the numbers she had been looking at for 4 years. She came back the next morning at 9 o'clock. She wore the ivory gown again. She sat down across from him, folded her hands on the desk between them, and said, "3 events, 1 season. Not a day more." The Duke of Rallenmere looked at her. "Agreed," he said. And something in his expression, so brief she would spend weeks wondering if she had imagined it, looked entirely, devastatingly, like relief. The gown had taken her 4 evenings, not because it was complicated. She had unpicked and remade more difficult things in worse light, but because her hands had not been entirely steady, which was an irritation she refused to examine too closely. It was ivory silk, 3 seasons old at the shoulders and new at the hem where she had let it out, with sleeves she had taken in and restitched twice until the drape was right. By the time she was finished, it was elegant. She knew it was elegant. She had made it elegant through sheer technical precision, which was, she had decided long ago, a perfectly acceptable substitute for money. She was ready at 7:30. He arrived at precisely 7:30. She had expected a footman. He came himself, which was already not what she had prepared for, and stood in the entrance hall of the Vane townhouse in black evening coat and white cravat, and looked at her in the way she was beginning to recognize: total, unhurried, as though he had all the time in the world and intended to use it. His gaze moved once, briefly, to her left cuff. "You altered the sleeves yourself," he said. "The stitching at the left cuff is tighter than the right." A pause, so short it was almost nothing. "You were nervous." The fury arrived so cleanly and completely that for a moment she could not speak. "Shall we go?" she said, which was not a question. He was not wrong. That was the worst of it. The Countess of Sefton's musicale occupied 3 floors of a Mayfair townhouse, blazing with candlelight, and the moment they entered, his hand at the edge of her elbow, barely touching, present nonetheless, Isolde felt the room change. It was subtle and total, the way a tide turns. Conversations didn't stop. They were redirected. Eyes moved with the careful indirection of people who were absolutely, completely looking. She understood, with the particular clarity of a woman who had spent years being invisible, what it meant to be seen beside him. The performance was by Schubert. She focused on it with the disciplined attention of someone using beauty as an anchor, and noted in her peripheral vision that Caelum Ashford did not focus on it at all. He was watching her. Not the room, not the performer, not the social calculations visibly occurring in every corner. Her. With that same intensity she had first seen in the firelit study, but different here, harder at the edges, more armored, as though the version of him that existed in public had been assembled from different materials than the one who had looked at her across a mahogany desk, and waited with the patience of a man who had been practicing it for years. She kept her eyes on the pianist. "You are staring," she said quietly, between movements. "I am aware," he said, and did not stop. The rain arrived without apology, the way London rain always did. Sudden, total, indifferent to whatever had been planned. Their drive in the park became, by quiet renegotiation conducted in the Vane entrance hall with water streaking the windows behind them, a tour of the Rallenmere Gallery. Caelum proposed it without flourish. Isolde accepted without hesitation, because she had learned in 3 weeks of this arrangement that hesitation cost more than it saved. And because the part of her that had always chosen books over ballrooms was already curious about what a man like him kept on his walls. The answer, it turned out, was everything. 3 rooms of old masters, 2 of family portraits, 1 long corridor of landscapes so precisely observed they made the actual English countryside feel like an approximation. She moved through them slowly, and Caelum moved beside her. And for the first 20 minutes, he said almost nothing, just watched her look. A chin lifted at an angle that suggested she was a little tipsy. Chin lifted at an angle that suggested she had been asked to sit still and had decided to comply only technically. "Who is she?" "My great-grandmother," Caelum said. "Evangeline Ashford. She was asked to leave 3 consecutive dinner parties for correcting the host's Latin." A pause. "Not accurately." Isolde looked at the portrait. The portrait looked back with the expression of a woman who had an opinion about everything and had made her peace with that fact. "She looks," Isolde said carefully, deeply unconvinced by everyone around her. "My grandmother described her as the most exhausting person she ever loved," Caelum said. "She meant it as the highest possible compliment." Something in his voice had changed. The armor that he wore in public, that careful surface of cool removal, had shifted almost without her noticing. He was talking the way people talk when they forget to be careful. Easily. Like himself. She laughed. Genuinely, without calculation, the kind of laugh that arrives before you can decide whether to allow it. He stopped talking. She turned and found him looking at her with an expression she had never seen on his face. All the control gone, or not gone, but suspended, held aside for one unguarded moment. He looked almost stricken, the way a man looks when something he has been bracing against arrives anyway, and is worse and better than he prepared for. He raised his hand toward her face. The gallery door opened. "Ralenmere." The voice was warm, socially polished, and arrived like a hand closing around something. "Forgive the intrusion. Your solicitor said I might wait in the—" Lord Fenwick Crowle stopped. He looked at Isolde with eyes that calculated everything they saw and revealed nothing that was calculated. Then he smiled, and it was the smile of a man who had just been handed something useful. "Miss Vane," he said, with a familiarity that had no right to exist. "What a very unexpected pleasure." The whispers reached her on a Thursday, through the least dramatic possible channel. Her youngest sister, Pen, who had heard it from a friend, who had heard it from her mother, who had heard it at a card party in Belgravia, where such things were deployed between hands with the casual precision of weapons no one wanted to claim. The Duke of Ralenmere, the story went, had a well-documented appetite for distressed assets. Estates bought at the bottom of their value. Businesses acquired at the precise moment of maximum vulnerability. Properties purchased from families who had no remaining leverage and therefore no remaining choice. It was, everyone agreed, a remarkable talent, almost an art form. And Miss Vane, the story continued, with the particular sympathy that was indistinguishable from satisfaction, was simply the latest entry in a very long ledger, an acquisition, not a courtship. Penn delivered this information with the anxious eyes of someone hoping to be told it was wrong. Isolde told her it was nothing, finished the column of figures she was working on, and sat very still for a long time after her sister left the room. And the problem was not that the rumor was cruel. The problem was that it was logical. She had done the mathematics herself, in the kitchen, at the table, in the gray early light of a Tuesday morning. A man like Caelum Ashford did not purchase other people's debts out of sentiment. He purchased them because he understood that debt was leverage, and leverage was control. And control was the language in which men like him conducted every meaningful transaction of their lives. She had agreed to 3 events and 1 season. She had signed nothing, but she had agreed. And there was a version of the story, a completely plausible, arithmetically coherent version, in which everything that had happened since was simply a duke managing an acquisition, with more patience and better manners than usual. The portrait in the gallery, his great-grandmother's expression, the laugh she had not meant to give him. She sent a note citing a headache and canceled the 2nd event. He replied the same afternoon. Brief, formal, perfectly correct. He hoped she would recover quickly. The handwriting was the same, precise, unhurried, but something in the phrasing had changed. Some temperature had dropped, and she recognized the shift because she had spent 3 weeks learning to read him, and she hated that she had. He came the following Tuesday, as the arrangement required, and he was immaculate and perfectly courteous, and entirely absent. The version of Caelum Ashford that existed in public, the armored one, the one made of title and composure, and the particular cold elegance of a man who needed nothing from anyone, and intended to make that clear. He handed her into the carriage. He sat across from her. He asked at appropriate intervals, appropriate questions. He did not once look at her the way he had looked at her in the gallery. She answered everything he asked with the level of courtesy she had been practicing since she was 16, and did not ask any of the questions she was actually thinking, because asking them required a vulnerability she had not agreed to anywhere in the terms of their arrangement. They were exquisitely, devastatingly polite to each other for 7 days. The silence was not cold, which would have been easier. It was careful. The silence of 2 people who had briefly, almost accidentally, shown each other something true, and had then, by unspoken agreement, decided that the safest response was to pretend it had not happened. It was the most exhausting week of her life, and she had once managed a household emergency involving a collapsed roof, 2 unpaid servants, and her father's gambling creditor arriving simultaneously on a Sunday. On the 7th evening, she sat at the kitchen table with the ledger open and the candle burning low, and she did not look at the numbers. So she looked at the wall. And she thought about a woman in a restoration portrait with her chin lifted at an angle that suggested she had been asked to sit still and had decided to comply only technically. She thought about a man who had noticed the stitching on her left cuff. She closed the ledger. She picked up her pen, and she began, for the first time in 7 days, to write something that was not a column of figures. She wrote 3 drafts of the letter, and burned all of them. On the first was too formal, the kind of prose she produced when she was frightened and trying not to show it, all correct sentences and careful distance. The second was too honest, which was a different problem entirely. The third, she read back and recognized, with a clarity that was almost funny, as the letter of a woman who had already made up her mind and was using ink and paper to avoid admitting it. She burned that one too. Then she put on her coat. The butler at Rallenmere House recognized her this time. She could see it in the microsecond of resignation that crossed his face before his professional composure reassembled itself. He began the correct sentence. "His Grace is not." And Isolde walked past him with the same unhurried certainty she had employed the first time, because it had worked the first time. And she was not a person who abandoned effective strategies on principle. She knocked once on the study door and opened it. Caelum was at the desk, a document in his hand, and he looked up with the swift, controlled attention of a man interrupted. And then something happened in his expression that she had no time to name before it was gone. "Miss Vane," he said. "Are the rumors true?" she said. Not a question. She had decided on the walk over that she was done softening things into questions. Am I a transaction? A distressed asset? A line in a ledger that you have decided to manage? The silence that followed was the longest she had ever sat inside. Longer than the Tuesday carriage ride, longer than the 7 days of careful courtesy. Long enough that the fire settled in the grate and the clock marked it. And she held herself absolutely still and did not fill it, because she had said what she came to say, and she was not going to undermine it by speaking first. Caelum set the document down. He did not reach for another one. He did not stand, did not move to the window, did not perform any of the small adjustments she had watched him make when he was reassembling his composure after something had disturbed it. He simply set the document down and looked at her. And for the first time since she had known him, he left his face entirely unguarded. It was a strange thing to witness, like watching a very old house with very thick walls finally let the light in. 2 years ago, he said, there was a creditor's auction in Clerkenwell, your father's paintings. She went still. You were there alone? No family? No maid? You had a list. I could see you consulting it. And you worked through it methodically, bidding on 3 specific pieces and nothing else. A landscape. 2 portraits. He paused. Your mother's favorites. I had been told she died the previous winter. Isolde said nothing. Her hands, folded in her lap, were very still. You had saved for months. It was visible in how you bid, carefully, with a ceiling, recalculating after each lot. When you secured the last one, you sat for a moment before you stood up. His voice was even, but stripped of everything decorative. I did not speak to you. I didn't know how to speak to you. So I did the only thing I knew how to do. You bought the debts, she said. Everyone. Within the week. The fire crackled. Outside, rain had begun again against the windows. Yet you have been protecting me, she said slowly, for 2 years, without my knowledge, without my consent. She looked at him steadily. You never once asked if I wanted it. He held her gaze. No, he said. I didn't. Why? The silence this time was different. Not the silence of a man composing himself, but of a man who has arrived at the exact edge of what he knows how to say, and is standing there looking at the distance between that edge and the truth. He had no answer. She had known. Somewhere beneath the walkover and the burned letters and the 7 days of devastating courtesy, that he wouldn't. And the fact that he didn't, that he sat across from her with his document set aside and his face unguarded and simply held the silence of a man who had run out of the language of acquisition and had not yet learned any other kind, was, against every reasonable expectation, the most honest thing anyone had offered her in years. She stood. She straightened her coat. It is too late to matter. Then she left it. Is too late to matter. Then she left, and did not burn the letter she wrote when she got home. The letter appeared in the Mayfair Courier on a Friday morning, tucked between an announcement of a baronet's engagement and a notice about the Countess of Sefton's upcoming charity concert, and as though it were simply another item of social record rather than a carefully constructed detonation. It was written in a woman's hand, neat, controlled, faintly anxious in the way of someone performing composure, and it detailed, with the specificity of an invoice, the precise terms of Miss Isolde Vane's arrangement with the Duke of Rallenmere, the debt cancellation, the 3 events, the season's worth of public appearances in exchange for financial relief. It is called figures. It used the word arrangement 4 times and the word courtship not once. The effect was immediate and total. By Saturday morning, Isolde's younger sister Pen had received 2 cancellations of invitations that had previously been accepted. By Saturday afternoon, her father, who moved through London's gentlemen's clubs with the cheerful obliviousness of a man who had never quite connected his own behavior to its consequences, was turned away at the door of his club with a murmured apology and an expression that suggested the murmuring pained the doorman considerably more than it would pain the management. By Sunday, the Vane household had received no cards, no calls, and no communications of any kind except a note from their landlord inquiring, with a politeness that did not quite conceal its anxiety, about the next quarter's rent. Isolde sat at the kitchen table and read the letter 3 times. Not from the newspaper, she had declined to purchase it, but in the copy her sister had brought home folded small. The way people fold things they are ashamed to be carrying. It was not her handwriting. She knew that immediately. With the absolute certainty of a woman who had written more documents than most solicitors and knew every habit of her own hand. The letter forms were close, carefully studied, practiced. But the pressure was wrong, and the way the writer formed a capital fee was entirely invented. She also knew, with the same cold clarity, exactly whose hands had constructed it. Caelum's secretary delivered the forgery evidence on Sunday evening. Handwriting analysis, with the account of a stationer on Duke Street, where Kroll had recently purchased writing supplies, a statement from a printer's assistant who had been paid insufficiently for his discretion. The secretary presented it to Caelum with the careful neutrality of a man who understood that what happened next was above his authority to anticipate. Caelum read it once, set it down, stood at the window of his study for a long time, looking at the rain-dark street below. He could dismantle Kroll from here, though he had done it before. The quiet, methodical withdrawal of financial support, the precise severing of social connections, the surgical application of consequences that left a man standing in a room from which every exit had been closed, before he noticed the doors were moving. It was, by any measure, what he was best at. It was safe. It was effective. It required nothing from him that he had not already demonstrated he possessed, or he could do the thing he did not know how to do. He could stand beside her, publicly, at the worst possible moment when standing beside her cost something real, when London was watching and the watching was not neutral, when his presence at her side would be read not as strategy but as declaration, and declarations required a vulnerability that he had spent 36 years ensuring no one ever asked of him. He picked up his coat. He did not send a note ahead. He did not instruct his secretary, did not alert his solicitor, did not make any of the careful preparatory arrangements that had preceded every significant action of his adult life. He simply went to her door, in the rain, without his umbrella, which he did not notice until he was already 3 streets away, and had decided, in the same moment he noticed, that turning back for it was not the kind of man he was attempting to become. She heard the knock at 7 in the morning. 7 in the morning was the hour for calling cards or social performances, or any of the carefully managed interactions that had constituted her life for the past several weeks. 7 in the morning was the hour for household accounts and cold tea, and the particular quiet of a family that had learned to move through its own home carefully, as though the floors might give way. She came downstairs in her morning dress, with her hair unpinned and her eyes carrying the full accumulated weight of a week of held-back fury, and she found him standing in the entrance hall with rain on his shoulders and a sheaf of documents in his hand, and she thought, with a clarity that surprised her, that he looked like a man who had made a decision and was prepared to be held to it. And the butler had the expression of someone who had opened the door to the Duke of Rallenmere at 7 in the morning and was still privately managing the implications. "Miss Vane," Caelum said. "You are very early," she said. "Yes." She looked at the documents. He held them out, not across a mahogany desk, not with the formal removal of a man conducting a transaction, but simply held them out, the way a person hands something to someone they trust to understand what it means. The first was Kroll's letter, with his secretary's handwriting analysis attached. Precise, methodical, annotated in margins with the particular thoroughness of a man who had been asked to be thorough and had taken it seriously. The stationer's account, the printer's statement, the forgery disassembled piece by piece until nothing remained of it but the evidence of its own construction. She read it carefully. She had known, but knowing and holding the proof were different things, and she allowed herself a moment to feel the difference before she set it aside. The second document was shorter, a full cancellation of the Vane debts, every creditor, every outstanding claim, the mortgage and the lease and everything accumulated between them. Signed, witnessed, dated that morning, effective immediately. No conditions attached, no season, no events, no arrangement of any kind. Just her family's name, cleared in his handwriting, with nothing asked in return. She looked at it for a long time. "This was always yours," he said. His voice was quiet, not the controlled quietness of a man managing his register, but the quietness of something said from a place below the performance. The season, the arrangement, I needed a reason to be near you that you would accept without refusing me at the door. I should have simply asked." The entrance hall was very still. Somewhere upstairs, the household was beginning to wake. She could hear pen moving, but the distant sound of the kitchen fire being built up. The ordinary sounds of a family starting an ordinary day, unaware that something was being decided below them. "You should have," she said. "I know." He held her gaze with the steadiness of a man who had decided that whatever this cost him, he was going to remain present for it. "I am asking now, not for anything the document required, not for the season or the appearances or any arrangement with terms and conditions and an exit built in." A pause. "I am asking whether you will allow me to try, without the debts between us, without anything between us. Only the truth of it, whatever that becomes." The document was still in her hands. She looked down at it, at her family's name, Freed, in his careful handwriting, and she thought about burned letters and gallery portraits, and a man standing in her entrance hall in the rain at 7 in the morning without his umbrella. "You walked here," she said, "in the rain." "Yes, without an umbrella." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. "I had made a decision. I didn't want to slow down." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she folded the cancellation document with the same precise care she gave everything that mattered, and held it against her chest and said, "Try then, and do not make me regret the invitation." What followed was not a storm. It was quieter than that and more complete. Within a fortnight, Lord Fenwick Crowle discovered that his lines of credit had been called in simultaneously by 3 separate institutions. His membership at 2 clubs was reviewed and not renewed. His solicitor, citing irreconcilable conflicts of interest, withdrew from his representation. The forgery evidence reached, through channels that were never publicly identified, the desk of the gossip columnist who had printed the letter, who retracted it the following Friday, with an apology so carefully worded it managed to assign blame without naming anyone, which was, in its way, more damaging than a direct accusation. Crowle did not leave England. He simply found, over the course of several methodical weeks, that England had become a place in which nothing worked for him anymore. No doors opened, no credit extended, no invitations arrived. He retreated to a property in the north that he could not afford to maintain and was not positioned to sell. He did not cease to exist. He simply ceased to matter, which Isolde suspected was the more considered punishment. She did not ask Caelum directly, but one evening, walking beside him in the Rallenmere gallery past the portrait of the great-grandmother with the impatient chin, she said, "It was very thorough." "Yes," he said. You enjoyed it," she said. A pause. "Somewhat," he said, with the fractional, almost smile she had learned to recognize as his version of a grin. "He touched something that was mine to protect. I have limited patience for that." She stopped walking. She turned to look at him with the full, steady attention she usually reserved for ledgers and structural problems. "I am not yours to protect," she said. "I am my own." "Yes," he said immediately. "And you have chosen to allow me to stand beside you. The distinction," he added, "is one I intend to spend considerable time honoring." She looked at him for a moment longer, Then she turned back to the portrait. "Good," she said. "See that you do." She had developed a habit of the gallery. It had begun practically. The key had been offered without ceremony 3 weeks ago. I sat on the edge of the desk between them with the same quiet matter-of-factness with which Caelum did everything that mattered. And she had accepted it without comment, because commenting would have made it into something that required a response. And she was still, even now, learning to receive things without immediately calculating what they cost. The gallery was warm in the afternoons, warmer than the Vane townhouse where the coal had to be managed carefully. And the light through the long windows was the particular quality of late spring light that made everything it touched look like it had been chosen. She stood before the great-grandmother's portrait and looked at the expression she had been told was her own, that barely contained impatience, that lifted chin, and thought, not for the first time, to that Evangeline Ashford looked like a woman who had arrived at a clear conclusion and was waiting with limited tolerance for everyone around her to catch up. She heard his footsteps in the corridor. She had learned them 3 chapters ago and saw no reason to pretend otherwise. Caelum came to stand beside her, and she turned to look at him, and she saw immediately that he was carrying something. A document, single page, older than the ones she had grown accustomed to seeing in his hands. There was an auctioneer's record from the year 1929. It was a record of a sale of a painting by a famous artist. The painting was a portrait of a woman. The woman was a famous actress. The actress was a famous singer. The singer was a famous dancer. The dancer was a famous model. Was an auctioneer's record from Clerkenwell. 2 years ago. 3 paintings listed by title. A landscape of the Vane Hertfordshire estate in summer, and 2 portraits she knew without needing the descriptions to identify them. Because she had sat across from them at dinner for the first 18 years of her life, and because she had saved for 11 months to buy them back, and because she had carried them home herself, in the rain wrapped in brown paper, because she could not afford a carter. The record showed her purchase. And then, the morning after, before the auction house had even filed the final accounts, a second transaction. The same 3 paintings, acquired from the same auctioneer, and by a private buyer whose name appeared at the bottom of the page in handwriting she would have recognized anywhere. Held in storage, under her name, for 2 years. She looked up at him. The fire in the gallery grate had been lit against the evening chill, and it caught the gold of his waistcoat buttons. The same warm amber light as the morning she had first sat across the mahogany desk from him, and demanded to know why. He looked back at her with his face entirely open. No armor, no management, nothing between his expression and its meaning. She did not ask why. She already knew. She had known, she thought, since the entrance hall at 7 in the morning, since the rain on his shoulders, since the umbrella he had not gone back for. "I bought your debts," he said quietly. "Not your love. I understood that from the beginning. I was simply hoping, in time, you might offer the second one freely." The gallery was very still around them. Outside, London continued its indifferent evening. Inside, the firelight held them in the same warm circle it had held them in from the beginning. the document between them like it always was, like a verdict, like a confession, like proof of something that had been true long before either of them found the language for it. She reached out and took the document from his hand. Then she took his hand. It was the first time she had done it. Not the managed contact of a public appearance, not the careful proximity of two people observing the terms of an arrangement, but simply her hand in his, her choice, freely made, with nothing owed and nothing extracted, and no column in any ledger that could account for it. "You could have asked," she said, "2 years ago, at the auction. You could have simply spoken to me." "I know," he said. "You could have asked at the desk, the first morning, before the arrangement, before any of it." "I know." "You are," she said, with the precision of a woman who had always called things what they were, "the most exhaustingly indirect man I have ever encountered." "Yes," he said. And there it was. Not the fractional, almost smile she had catalogued over weeks, but the real one, the rare one, the one that arrived without permission and changed his entire face into something that had no business being as devastating as it was. "I am asking now." She looked at him with the fierce, searching, the fully awake attention she had given everything that mattered her entire life. Every ledger, every letter, every column of figures that stood between her family and catastrophe. And she understood, in the particular way that things become clear when you stop managing them and simply look, that this was the same. That he had always been the same. A man who had spent his life acquiring because he did not know how to ask, standing in the firelight at last with nothing in his hands but the truth of it. "Then yes," she said, "you may ask." His hand closed around hers, careful, certain, the grip of a man who had been waiting long enough that he intended, now that he was permitted, to hold on properly. Outside London. Inside, firelight and the portrait of a woman with a lifted chin and an expression of barely contained impatience that looked, in the warm amber glow of a late spring evening, something very close to satisfied. Two people who had spent their lives managing alone, one through pride, one through power, both through the exhausting, costly, ultimately insufficient armor of self-sufficiency, standing at last in the same light. Finally, completely and without condition, willing to need each other. She had developed a habit of the gallery. It had begun practically. The key had been offered without ceremony 3 weeks ago. Is set on the edge of the desk between them, with the same quiet matter-of-factness with which Caelum did everything that mattered. And she had accepted it without comment, because commenting would have made it into something that required a response, and she was still, even now, learning to receive things without immediately calculating what they cost. And that, my friends, is where we leave them. In the firelight. Hands joined. The document between them is no longer a ledger of debts, but a record of the longest, most quietly devastating act of devotion one person has ever conducted in the language of finance, rather than feeling. Two people who had spent their entire lives being extraordinarily capable of everything except letting someone in, standing at last in the same warm light, having chosen, finally, the harder and braver thing. I have to tell you something. When I first sat with this story, with Isolde in her altered ivory gown walking uninvited through a duke's door, with Caelum setting down his document and, for the first time in 36 years, leaving his face completely unguarded, I did not expect it to move me the way it did. But that is the thing about stories like this one. They are not really about debt or power or the machinery of the London season. And they are about the moment a person who has been managing alone for so long they have forgotten there was ever another option, looks across a firelit room and thinks, perhaps not alone. Perhaps, at last, not alone. I think most of us know something about that. About the pride that keeps us capable and isolated in equal measure. About the power we accumulate to fill the space where vulnerability was supposed to live. About the thing we want to say and the 11 months we spend saving up to say it indirectly, hoping the other person will understand what the gesture means so we never have to say the words out loud. Caelum bought the paintings. He bought the debts. He walked 3 streets in the rain without his umbrella. And in the end, he asked, "That is the whole story. That is all any of it was ever about. If this story found you tonight, if Isolde's steadiness reminded you of your own, if Caelum's impossible indirectness made you recognize someone, if the gallery and the firelight and the document held out like a confession made something move in your chest that you were not entirely expecting, then please tell me. Leave a comment below and tell me which moment stayed with you. Tell me the line that broke something open. Tell me where you are in the world right now and what time it is, and whether you are listening alone or with someone beside you. I read every single one. And every comment is a conversation, and I do not take that lightly. If you are new here, if this is the first story of mine that found you, then please subscribe, because there are more of these waiting, and I would very much like you to be here for them. Each one is built with the same care, the same belief that a story told well is one of the few things in this world that makes the distance between people feel smaller. And if this story moved you, if it is the kind of thing you would want a friend to find on a difficult evening or a quiet Sunday, or any of the ordinary moments when what a person needs most is to be reminded that being seen is possible, then share it. Pass it along. Let it find the people it was made for. I bought your debts, not your love. But you, my friends, your being here, your listening, your comments and your shares, and the simple fact of your company at the end of a long day, that has never once felt like a transaction. That has always felt like the real thing. Until next time.